Yet, even in Africa, a predominantly black continent, right? Even in Tanzania, a predominantly black country, I can't even have the luxury of being whoever I want to in my dreams because the clutches of that manageable box of limitations that was defined by colonialism and slave trade and the horrors of it, like immediate African history still plague us today. Like that damn box is inescapable, bro. So earlier last March, I took myself on a solo date because I was trying to find inspiration because I was crashing out. I really was. Anyways, one of the places that inspire me the most is museums. And a little fun fact about me is that I live in China, so there is an overabundance of museums. These people take their history very seriously. If there is a concept out there, I promise you, there is a museum behind it, right? And I went to a museum of writing and publications because I was feeling like I was having writer's block at the time. And I also went to visit a Greek exhibit at my local museum that was basically a collaboration between a bunch of museums in Greece and the local museum in China. Yeah. And I was awestruck, as I usually am in museums, because I love history. I love being able to know and peek into the minds of what people were worrying about back then, what they loved, what their hopes for the future was, what consumed their daily lives. It's kind of reassuring to know that we all worried about the same thing. But in all of that joy, in all of that awe, something kept eating away at my heart, my African heart. And that was, why is this not a thing in Africa? Why don't we have a culture of going back into the past and preserving it through museums? Is all of African history just lost to the colonial conquest? And most importantly, what is the basis of my pride as an African? So before I start this portion of the video, hello, this is Orai Rambles if you do not know, and welcome to my channel. Here we ramble about everything. I pride myself in my capacity to over-explain and overthink even the simplest of topics. I'm trying to be consistent though. And if you are not new, welcome back. How's it going? I miss you. I know it's been a long time since I last posted. As I mentioned earlier, I was crashing out. I'm in a transitional phase in my life right now, so. But if you're looking to interact with me more, I have a TikTok and I also have an Instagram where I post more short rambles. So if you watch this video and you feel like you want to get to know more about me, those are in my description. Other than that, let's go to the video, okay? So another fun fact about me is that I'm from Tanzania, which is a country on the eastern part of the African coastline. And if you're familiar with Zanzibar, the Serengeti, yeah, that's my country. So a lot of Africans, including myself, find it very hard to think of a history beyond colonialism. And I don't blame us, because when I was growing up in primary school and middle school and we were learning about our history, we skimmed briefly through Tanzanian history, how we fought for independence, getting the forming of our governments and other social history. And then we immediately jumped to Egyptian history. And then after that, we went to Rome and the Greek history and then World War history. And that was it. And in the moment, it felt very weird because it felt as if other African countries didn't exist in the context of world history. You would think that as an African country, we would also learn about our neighboring countries, for example, and all the other countries within the continent, the same way a European student, for example, would be learning world history, and they will learn about the history of other European countries. Yet here I was, a student in Africa, learning briefly about how we fought for independence, and then straight to Egypt, and then outside the continent. And I personally would hate to believe that Egypt is the only country in Africa worth learning about. And before, let me give you a visual, like, imagination, okay? We have Egypt in Northern Africa, right? And then we have my country and a bunch of other East African countries that share Lake Victoria. Why I mention these two is that Egypt is connected to East Africa through the Nile. You're trying to tell me Egypt at any particular point in time never decided to go across the Nile the way people migrate for resources or whatever, and you are trying to tell me people from East Africa or along the Nile never chose to interact? Finally, during their interaction, you're trying to tell me they left nothing? Like nothing was left and only Egypt chose to record stuff? Because all of the things I've realized about history is that if you guys share some sort of water body or something, you guys are interacting. You guys are sending messages or something. Like there is some sort of resource and network being had across that water body because we are just humans. We migrate for resources as other animals do. I would hate to believe that in Africa, the only history worth learning that is rich enough is Egypt and maybe like Timbuktu and in Mali. I would hate to believe that. Yet, when we look back in history, when we choose to look back in history in a lot of African countries, we're immediately faced with the horrors of colonialism and the slave trade across all the African coasts for the most part. We're faced with the inhumane treatment of the peoples of the coast and within the country for dimes that a lot of those people's lineage and their ancestors never got to see, for dimes that went directly to benefit the industrial revolution for Western countries, for dimes that are still holding Africans hostage and costing wars today, you know? Okay, I'm gonna sidetrack right now. I hate the fact that when we think about colonialism, we think about it as something that happened eons ago, when in reality, there are countries out there that got their independence less than 50 years ago, meaning someone's father and mother, someone's aunt, someone's grandparents lived through that. Future historians will look into the 2000s as the aftermath of colonialism, meaning it's either still alive and well and there are things still being dismantled till today. Yet for some reason we try to put pressure on Africa to kind of cause insane development quickly when in reality we are in the aftermath, right? There are countries out there that are fighting to stop paying taxes to France for their own independence. Do you see how crazy that sounds? And because I lived in China, sometimes I like to make parallel, I can't say that word, parallels. China had the whole 100 century of humiliation before they got into being the prosperous country that they are today. I recommend you look into that. And they didn't even go through half the shit that Africans as a continent did, but they did go through a lot, you know? But it took them 100 years of being robbed, humiliated, and rebuilding, failing, rebuilding again to get to where they are. The point I'm trying to make is sometimes I don't blame African countries and their avoidance towards learning their history because it's like a cultural PTSD. When you try to do that, immediately you're faced with this very huge elephant, this huge colonial slave trade elephant that just gives you violence. It's an elephant that still tramples onto the land today that it's really hard to avoid. And even when we are learning about our history, about colonialism and stuff, it's always from the perspective of the colonial powers, never from the narratives of the people that actually survived, the people that fought. It's very rare that you see that.
Nice.
I would just like to preface that this video is gonna be a circle of thoughts I've had towards African culture as a whole. And I feel like it probably will have some parallels with Black culture everywhere else because I would say when you look into Black history globally, there is the huge violent elephant of, well, the horrors of the slave trade and colonialism, right? The UN recently arrived at the consensus that transatlantic slave trade is the greatest crime in humanity. And a lot of the predominantly white countries either abstained from voting or they voted against it. And the ones that voted against it were the usual suspects, the US and Israel and also Argentina, surprisingly. Someone explained that to me. Um, to further expand, or rather add on, as to why I think not only the transatlantic slave trade, but the colonialism of the African continent as a whole was considered the gravest crime in humanity, is because it's not just about the inhumane and violent treatment of a group of peoples. It wasn't just that, oh my god, these people were treated less than animals were treated. They were eating people. White people were eating black people, guys. Like, not just in America, even in Africa. Like, it's not just about that. It is also the psychological warfare that was had on the black peoples as well. We think about things like eugenics. I don't know if I can say that on YouTube. And trying to justify creating systems to justify not only to the people who were white or other races of people that black people deserve to be treated that way, but also to justify to black people themselves that they deserve to be treated that way. That sort of psychological warfare has followed us all till today. It is still even in the way that countries manage their governments, I would say. This dehumanization, I would say, like the culture of dehumanization, created a culture of limitations that plague black communities all over the world. Like, from the skin color, dehumanization of our skin color, the dehumanization of our hair, the dehumanization of our culture, our customs, our food, everything we did was belittled and trampled on to the point where it would have been better if a dog did it. That's how bad it was back then. This culture of limitations essentially stripped black peoples, the African peoples, of their individuality, the humanity, and put them into this manageable box, a sort of cog that would fit right well into the industrial and colonial machine. This box would then create a set of expectations of black people's rights, black people's limits, black people's potential, our everything we could be, essentially, was reduced into this box. Because of this box, a lot of black people and African countries in general exist in a way that I would call it like the right way to be black. I don't know how else to explain this. The right way to be African. And a lot of what is considered this right way to be African is very limited. It's by parameters that were drawn the same way them squiggly lines were drawn to make African borders, but like they were drawn to essentially limit Africans from full range of humanity, you know, I will explain an example about this later, but I often think about how we often talk about the physical violence of colonialism, but we rarely talk about the psychological violence, you know. Yeah, there are people that said the studies that trauma gets passed down generationally. So sometimes the trauma responses that your great grandparents had, you could find yourself experiencing the same thing, you know. So I ask myself, if we were to ignore completely the externalized systems of abuse towards black people and focus solely on the damage it has had psychologically, and then the information that it gets passed down genetically, do you see now why it's one of the gravest crimes in humanity? The dehumanization is so bad that countries that weren't even involved in the slave trade, people from countries who, just like us, were slaved, think of us as less than human. I see the memes that we make about African people. Exactly. That's why I'm saying we are in the aftermath of colonialism and slave trade. So if there are countries out there that got their independence less than 50 years ago, If the Mississippi in the United States abolished slavery in 2013, I was shocked to find that information too. If we are still feeling the dehumanization and destabilization effects of industrialization and colonialism today, the clutches are still tight today, then the psychological implications still hold true, especially to a group such as the African continent. Like, this situation not only just affects our sense of self as African peoples, it also affects how we run our governments, how we handle international relations. It affects our relationships with our hopes and our dreams. As a peoples, there was a period of time where we weren't even allowed to dream for a better world, right? To now having agency. Imagine how that works. Imagine how that plays governmentally. When I think about why the UN has chosen to make this a grave crime against humanity, I think that the damage towards not only our identity, but our relationship with history as a collective of people adds for a good reason. Because, again, I like to use China as parallels because I live here. And they too went with their own horrors with the West and Japan, right? But it was never to the point where they lost touch with their history. And people like to say it's because they've been recording since the beginning of time. And I agree, they have a very long history of recording. But what was severed in China wasn't their cultural identity. It wasn't their identity as Chinese peoples. It was humiliation. Definitely. Right, because it used to be a superpower back then, with this during the Belt and Road situation. No, the Silk Road situation. But with Africa, it was more than just humiliating. It was beyond that. The damage towards Africa was truly one about sovereignty, sovereign identity. We don't have a collective culture of appreciating our history and romanticizing our past and romanticizing our identity and all this thing because it was replaced with some of the most disgusting form of violence the humankind has ever seen. Violence that I'm surprised a lot of people don't know of. Violence that is still going on today at the hands of Western powers too. And Eastern. We keep forgetting about the Eastern Arab world and their effects on Africa, guys. So, a good example about a culture of limitation that I think stems from colonialism and slave trade in general is calling black people Oreo. I made a video about this on my Instagram and a lot of people tend to I'd agree with me, but if you were an eccentric black kid back then or even right now, a kid that quote unquote did not act black enough, the word Oreo or some variation of that word is not something you're strange to, right? For those who aren't familiar, an Oreo is essentially a cookie that's black on the outside and has white cream filling on the inside. So when you're acting in a way that's not quote unquote black, they call you an Oreo because you're acting white. And this word or variations of this word plagued my everyday life. I grew up, as I mentioned, in Africa, bro. And I grew up in a very multicultural part of Tanzania, right? There were black kids, Chinese kids, other Asian kids, white kids where I grew up, okay? And due to my eccentricities, my little weird girl tendencies back then, I would often hear people, African people, tell me that I don't fit in, that I'm not African enough or Tanzanian enough. Heck, till today, bro. I remember I went to a bar a few months ago for Valentine's Day. And I was talking to a bunch of South Africans, and they told me you are not South African. No, sorry, not South African. They told me that I'm not African enough because my name is not an African name. And I get that, but the person was Indian, Southern African, telling me this. Imagine.
The woman was too stunned to speak.
Growing up, constantly being nitpicked because of my eccentricities and people telling me that, oh my god, you are not African, you don't fit in the box. And it was only towards me. There were other weird kids in my area as well who were Asian, who were white, right? And they never got told that. And I used to sit down and ask myself, why are they allowed to basically do whatever? But when I do it, I'm apparently going against the grain of Africanness. It goes even beyond just eccentric tastes and hobbies as a kid. I remember when I was a kid, I used to be very into robotics, the study of planets. I was a nerd. I liked looking into rocks and shit. I was into a lot of nerdy things, and sometimes I would talk about it to the people that maybe I'd go to church with or maybe friends from my neighbors. And I remember there was a time I was talking to one of my nannies, and before you call me a rich kid, okay, it's quite common to have a nanny back home because they don't have protections. It's a long story. We're gonna talk about this another time, okay? But like, I remember talking to my nanny about this, and I was like, um, when I grow up, I want to do robotics, and I want to create robots that essentially like heal cells by fighting, like going that can be digestible or something like that, something along those lines. And my nanny looked at me and she was like, good for you, but those are white people dreams. What does that mean? White people dreams, you know? And that's when I realized what it means to be black is literally a limit. Blackness is defined by limitation. Africanness is defined by limitation. And I understand there's a lot of realism in what she said, that these are white people dreams, because if you think about the infrastructure in my country around that time, yes, we didn't have the subsidies for that. There were no programs for that at the time. But like, what do you mean I'm not even allowed to dream because it's a white person's dream? You know? That's how far these limitations go. I used to ask myself, why did it seem like there was only one way to be African? And why was it so freaking fragile, that the moment I do anything different, the whole box of Africanness collapses? Why was that? I also used to wonder if there was a Kyle in the United States who got teased by his white counterparts, being like, yo, you don't listen to like garage rock music. You know? You're not white enough, Kyle. You need to do some more white shit. You don't listen to country music, Kyle. In comparison, it felt like white people and other races of people could essentially do and dream and be whatever it is they wanted to be, even in their heads, like without it being targeting their racial identity. But for a black person, you can't do that. Anything you do somehow is a reflection of blackness, when in reality, it should just be a skin color. It feels like white people are allowed to be whatever they want to be, and that just be a skin color thing. In Africa too. Yet, even in Africa, a predominantly black continent, right? Even in Tanzania, a predominantly black country, I can't even have the luxury of being whoever I want to in my dreams, because the clutches of that manageable box of limitations that was defined by colonialism and slave trade and the horrors of it, like immediate African history, still plague us today. Like, that damn box is inescapable, bro. And that box, the box of what it means to be black, of what it means to be African, is so small, yet so never ending in its presence and clutches and hold on the community, the global community of black people in the world. It seemed to consume everything and everyone I talked to at the time, sometimes even still today. Anyways, enough of my Oreoism trauma, back to African pride. So I say all of this to ask, are we as Africans really proud to be African? Because, lately with the globalization finally hitting some of our media exports, like Tyla, for example, or the guy that sang, I forgot his name, he's saying, Ondilo, Burna Boy. With with Africa essentially gaining more global traction, right? And a lot of us essentially being proud of being Africans. I ask myself, what does it even mean to be proud? What are we proud of? You know? Because I'm a woman. Sorry, I have like all of my devices right now. Because I'm a woman of definitions, okay? I love definitions. I might as well just be a lawyer at this point, all right? We're going to look at the definitions of pride. Okay. Pride is essentially a feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own achievements, the achievements of those with whom one is closely associated, from qualities or possessions that are widely admired. And my other favorite is the consciousness of one's own dignity. What is dignity, you ask? Dignity is the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect, or a sense of pride in oneself. We have our modern achievements as Africans. I'm not gonna sit here and lie, you know. But if we're to go back to the lady who told me that being a girl in robotics is essentially a white people dream, um, we also had achievements pre-colonialism. A lot of global propaganda had tried to make it so that it looked like Africans never contributed anything towards the global accounts of knowledge that we have accumulated over time, and all we had to offer was Mali's Timbuktu and Egypt. And I don't believe that. I've noticed that one of the things that a lot of Black people across the world in and outside of Africa share is pride in suffering, because our immediate history is so full of surviving suffering, fighting suffering, and fighting against suffering, that, to be honest, it kind of became a part of us. A lot of Africans, and I would even say Black people in general, take pride in suffering because it's what hits us immediately. It's why a lot of Black and African movies are about struggle, strife, as if Black people do not know any other form of emotion, as if Black people did not contribute anything else. And sometimes I ask myself if that is one of the things that we know in our history. It's one of the things that were one of the most dominant themes that occupy our sense of pride. What is stop us from us becoming our suffering and essentially continuing a cycle, a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy cycle of creating the suffering so we can have something to be proud of, aka a lot of what the African governments is doing in Africa. I often ask myself, if we don't know what happened before us, if we don't go beyond colonialism, we will not be able to find out that Africa has contributed a lot more than just suffering for the colonial and industrial complex, right? That Africans contributed to the world. Africans were not just fucking ooga booga cavemen, even though they would like you to believe that. There are countries there are tribes, or kingdoms in East Africa that had perfected C-sections, sterilized C-sections before the West ever found it. How do we in the modern day claim to fight for African interests when a lot of what is shaping our history is the colonial retelling of colonialism, the colonial powers retelling of colonialism, and thus the retelling of our history and our identity? I grew up in Tanzania, spent 17 years, and the most recurring question was why it seemed that everything that seems to shape our cultural taboos, is directly related to what colonial powers told us were taboo. You know? I think about things like the LGBTQ. They were they were entire civilizations in Africa that had already embraced that concept. I think about things like women equality. Africa has one of the highest femicide rates in the world, the continent that is. There are African countries out there that do inhumane things to women. And it was a direct cultural export from the slavery, either with the Arabs or slavery from Western powers. Because a lot of countries before, a lot of tribes, a lot of kingdoms before that were egalitarian. So I'm like, if we don't go back into our history, pre-colonialism, whatever we are clinging on as part of our African identity is not ours. It is essentially the colonial box of what it is to be African. And I understand that when your country is going through economic crises, it is hard to prioritize your resources into understanding your history. But one of the things I've learned about history while living in China, especially as it relates to international relations and economics and government, it is very important to know your people and to know their history so you can make the right decisions for yourself. Because how can you say you're going out there to represent your country or Africans' best interests when your story about Africa starts with colonialism? That story isn't even about us, bro. That story, we aren't even the main character. We are the fodder for the machine. So, how are we going to progress as a community of African countries if we don't know what came before us? Because if we don't know what came before us, how do we know if where we're going is for us? Bars, put on a t-shirt. Sometimes I feel like the African identity essentially was kind of cut like a plant. The roots were cut off and then submerged in a container filled with water. And that water is essentially colonial times. And the plant and those roots took the shape of that water. And we're at a point in time now that we've been liberated from that, where the water is stagnant, the water is old, the roots are praying for ground. And I think the ground lies in our history beyond that. I think African pride is still far too shallow because a lot of African countries define themselves by the definitions set by people who aren't African. I know this video was kind of all over the place. I'm feeling a little bit manic recently, but I'm kind of trying to not be a perfectionist and create content and just think about the repercussions later, really. If you like this video or you found it interesting or there's something you'd like to add on, please do. I love reading your comments. I love getting to know more because a lot of my thoughts aren't full stops, but rather open ended question marks as I'm trying to gain more perspective. Um, if you like it, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps me a lot. And yeah, bye bye.